Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining Heritage Talks Online. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm here with Glenn Patterson, and we are project directors for the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, otherwise known as QAHN. QAHN is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec, and in particular of Quebec's English-speaking communities that are spread right across the province. If you go to our website at QAHN.org, you will discover the activities and projects that we're involved in. And you can also see our projects on the QAHN Facebook pages as well, including the schedule for Heritage Talks Online. Our winter-spring series has only a few weeks left to go, but you can see the remaining presenters, the speakers' topics, and the times of their broadcast on our public Facebook page. If you've missed any of the past talks, you can find them on the Heritage Talk Facebook page, as we've recorded all of them. You're welcome to become a member of QAHN, and membership is open to everyone, including community groups and heritage organizations. So please check our website for more information on becoming a member. Membership gives you access to interesting workshops and programs and projects, and to our quarterly publication called Quebec Heritage News. This is filled with articles and images about Quebec's history and people and places. So if you love a good story and you want to find out more about the people that make up Quebec and the English-speaking population here, and learn about events and activities that you will not hear in history textbooks, I encourage you to become a member, receive your own copy, and join our dynamic network of people. For first-time new members, you can take advantage of a special 30% discount promotion for a one-year membership. That's $20 for a one-year membership. If you'd like to claim the discount, you can send us a Facebook message. And if you're on Zoom tonight, you can send us a message in chat box that you're interested in becoming a member. But you have to do it during the length of the broadcast. It's only good for this hour. So don't wait, sign up and become a QAHN member and become a part of a great community of people who love history. I would like to thank the funders who make this series possible, including Canadian Heritage, the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers, the Chalkers Foundation, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy is an historian and an award-winning author who specializes in Black Canadian history. She has authored 3 books, including The Road to Now, A History of Blacks in Montreal, which is the only chronological study of Blacks on the island. She has contributed to many scholarly and academic publications and has penned numerous popular articles and magazines and newspapers. Dorothy's company, blackbiblio.com, promotes African Canadian history and heritage using the ABCs of Canadian Black History Kit, an educational tool that enhances the learning experience of students about Blacks in Canada. Her talk this evening is called They Call Me Mr. Gibbs, a portrait of a Father of Confederation. Good evening, Dorothy, and welcome to Heritage Talks Online.
Okay, good evening. Thank you. I'm just going to go in and set my screen up. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you, Heather, for that introduction, and QAHN for the opportunity to talk with you today about a Black historical figure whose role in the making of Confederation is probably unknown, except to a handful of West Coast Black historians. The talks I've given in the past for QAHN have had a particular focus. That is, they all related to the unknown Black English-speaking history in the province of Quebec. Those of you aware of my life's research, I've also tried to reveal the Black experience outside of the province. Since I learned of Gibbs decades ago, I have been intrigued. For that reason, I also included Gibbs' story in the ABCs of Canadian Black History Kit, a pedagogical toolkit I developed for public school teachers. Including Gibbs in the kit was a no-brainer to me because I believe that more Canadians should know about him. Another reason why at this time the story of Mifflin Wistar Gibbs is so important and should be known has to do with reconsideration of the making of Confederation in Canadian historiography. This has to do with an interrogation of just who should be considered a father of Confederation. The Fathers of Confederation is a very exclusive male club. Only 36 men have been let into the club. What criteria historians use to select these 36 men? It's very simple. History has chosen to honor certain men because these individuals represented North American, British American colonies at one or more of the conferences that led to Confederation and to the creation of the Dominion of Canada. Canada's historians have said that these 36 men played such significant roles in their respective provinces that the Dominion of Canada, our very country, came into existence. Let me get back to the push for a reinterpretation of this term, the Fathers of Confederation. Other historians are challenging this criteria, and I've seen the term Mothers of Confederation, which of course speaks to the broadening, which of course speaks to the broadening of the, I'm having a bit of trouble.
No problem. You got it, Dorothy.
Yeah, no, I'm just having a bit of trouble here trying to coordinate with what I'm saying. Okay, right. Other historians are challenging that criteria. I've seen the term Mothers of Confederation, which of course speaks to broadening the valorization of gender and the work these historians have been doing, and how various women played distinctive roles that led to Confederation. This exclusive club is also a challenge for historians who have uncovered critical players in regional or provincial politics, who for various factors were not at the time around the table for the initial signing of documents on July 1st, 1867. Most persuasive argument I've seen thus far being put forth is that Louis Riel, once known as a traitor, played a significant role in bringing the prairie provinces into Confederation. He too is not one of the vaunted 36. Progressive historians want to open wide the doors in the club, and they're now considering that indeed the definition should be expanded to include those men who were instrumental after the fact in the creation of Manitoba, in bringing in British Columbia, PEI, and Newfoundland into Confederation, and even the creation of Nunavut in 1999. It is at this juncture that I realized there could also be a case made for Mifflin Gibbs in British Columbia, and it should not just be Black historians touting his membership. If you understood one thread running through many of the historical presentations I have done, it's that I've uncovered what is missing from the narrative in Quebec. And despite the Parks Canada plaque on Gibbs' story as it relates to British Columbia and Confederation is missing in the writings of the province's historical history, colonial history, and specifically the historiography of British Columbia's entry into Confederation. Okay, enough background. Let me introduce you to Mifflin Wistar Gibbs. Gibbs was born in 1823 in Philadelphia. He was one of 4 children of free parents, Jonathan C. Gibbs and Maria Gibbs. His father, a Methodist minister, died in 1831 and left his invalid wife to raise 4 children. She became a laundress and was unable to care for all of her children. Mifflin was 8 years old. He was sent to work and he started driving a doctor's horse, but eventually became a carpenter's apprentice at the age of 16, and subsequently a journeyman contractor. At the same time, Mifflin continued his education and became literate through the Philadelphia Library Company, what they call a colored men's literary society. This group had prominent members like Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists. Not surprisingly, in the company of these activists, Gibbs became active in the Underground Railroad with William Still and others. By 1849, Gibbs had become prominent enough in the East Coast abolitionist movement to accompany Frederick Douglass on a dangerous speaking tour for abolition in Western New York State. While on tour, his life abruptly took a new course after talks with prospectors convinced him to go to California to seek his fortune. At the age of 22, with just 10 cents in his pocket, he arrived in San Francisco in September 1850. He found a job building a house and earned good money, but it was short-lived because when the white crewmates refused to work with him, he was reluctantly let go. After racial prejudice forced him to quit carpentry work, he found new work in retail clothing, and after a year of diligent savings, he used his earnings to become a partner in a clothing firm which specialized in fine imported clothing. The store, Lester and Gibbs, prospered. And Gibbs, building on his activist experience on the Underground Railroad, quickly became known as a leader among many leaders. The community of Blacks in San Francisco were most often highly educated entrepreneurial merchants, investing much in their businesses. And Lester, but especially Gibbs, he joined with other Blacks to begin to organize in response to the worsening climate of racial prejudice and anti-Black legislation that was happening in California at the time. It wasn't always like this. California was a slave-free state, but as more whites entered, fueled by the gold rush fever in California, it became increasingly difficult for Blacks to hold on to the civil liberties that the state originally offered. The state legislature had tried to ban the Black migration into California, but that failed. So they decided to institute a law that a Black person could not serve in the military and couldn't vote. Even worse, in 1852, California passed a law prohibiting Black testimony in court, so Blacks could not take an oath. The implications were widespread. This meant a Black person could not file a claim for a gold mine, if they did find gold, since he could not obtain a legal document. It also meant if a Black business was robbed or a Black farmer was cheated out of land, none of them could swear a legal complaint or bring a white person to court. Black individuals in California were under increasing legal terror and Black businesses under threat. Black businesses were targeted due to the levy of a poll tax that they decided to set up, even though Black owners could not vote. This was galling, and Lester and Gibbs refused to pay the poll tax. Here's where they drew the line. So the government seized their inventory and put it up for auction. On the day of the auction, a white friend of Gibbs moved around the crowd and he urged people not to bid on the lot. So there were no bids, and as a result, their merchandise got returned. But the worsening situation in the state needed a remedy. Such moves by the state government only served to dampen Black prosperity, and the business outlook was gloomy. Blacks organized statewide conventions to counter California's increasing racial animus against them and their success. The first was convened in 1854. Thanks to his increasing wealth and prominence, Gibbs readily stood as a delegate at these Negro conventions that were held in 54, 55, and 1857. In 1855, the convention proposed a newspaper to advocate their case. Gibbs was chosen to head the project, and Mirror of the Times was soon being sold in 30 California communities from the Mexican border to the Oregon line. Editor Gibbs urged Blacks to give up being waiters, boot blacks and servants, and instead pursue farming and mechanical trades. He also used the paper to counter the normalization of enslavement within the state, because according to their constitution, they were slave-free. At each convention, delegates considered abandoning the state. Panama, Mexico, Vancouver Island were popular choices. Each year brought significantly more reasons to emigrate. As a result of 3 events, eventually the scales tipped in favor of Vancouver Island. The first was the news of the Fraser River Gold Rush. The second was the United States Supreme Court Dred Scott case ruling in March of 1857. That case by the Supreme Court said that free, native-born Black Americans could not be considered citizens, and that whites did not have to regard the rights of Blacks. Needless to say, racial animus increased across the country. The worst excesses were that Black women had little protection from sexual assault or being brutalized. And the kidnapping of Blacks to re-enslave them increased. And the random terror of kidnapping unsuspecting Black men and boys off the street for lynch parties or picnics was no longer an isolated incident. It was not just property. Blacks could not even defend themselves against personal injury. So emigration was their only choice. Over 200 Blacks met together in Zion Church in San Francisco on April 14, 1858. Also in attendance that same night was Jeremiah Nagel. He was captain of the steamer Commodore that did regular runs to Victoria. He offered to answer any questions that the crowd had about the colony of Victoria. On April 20th, 35 Blacks who had gotten permission to travel boarded the Commodore for Vancouver. This advance party, called the Pioneer Committee, did reconnaissance on behalf of San Francisco Blacks. On April 25th, 3 committee members met with James Douglas, who was governor of the British colony. After spending approximately 2 weeks in Victoria checking out the opportunities, one of the members of the Pioneer Committee returned back to San Francisco. His name was Mercier, and he had a glowing report. Once back at the church, Mercier told a gathering of 350 people that British Columbia was the promised land and a land of freedom and humanity. Thanks to Governor Douglas, Blacks were welcomed with open arms. Mercier continued that James Douglas was very happy to learn of their intention to come to his province and even sympathized with their plight in California. Governor Douglas had given the committee a blueprint for settlement in the colony. And as you can see, the civic freedoms that he said they would experience were a stark contrast to limits placed upon them in the United States. That same evening, attendees were ecstatic when a letter from William Delby Moses, one of the pioneers, was read. Moses' letter described Victoria as one of the garden spots of the world. The climate is most beautiful. The strawberry vines and peach trees are in full blow. All the color man wants here is ability and money. Victoria, the letter continued, is a godsend plan for the colored people. So 350 people in the church said it was to be Victoria. And that same evening, those 100 Blacks passed a remarkable resolution which became a pact. They all agreed that once they got to Victoria, they would not seek separate institutions or facilities. They were determined to be in sync with everybody else in the colony. Unless significantly pushed to do so, they would not create Black churches. They would not agree to segregated schools or other major institutions wherein they would be seen as socially distanced or stigmatized. All this could be summed up as hyperbole on the part of the settlers and wishful thinking by Governor James Douglas. But it did set the tenor for the arrival of San Francisco Blacks into Victoria, BC. It may not be difficult to figure out why the Blacks would have wanted to send a positive report back to San Francisco. But Governor Douglas' motivation requires a little bit more thought as to why he embraced these potential settlers. Some Black historians have believed it's because Governor James Douglas himself was a Black man. He was a Black Guyanese of a Black mother and a Scottish father, and he was comfortable around Black men. Well, other historians ascribe his motivations to the reality of his job. Douglas knew that the island needed all the settlers it could get. He appears to have had some foresight as well, because he was looking for a bulwark against the simmering tensions that was developing with First Nations. Moreover, Douglas believed that Americans would be best placed as police against the throngs of Americans coming in as prospectors, gold prospectors, and passing through the colony. These reports and Douglas's assurances sealed the deal for Gibbs. But Gibbs delayed and meticulously planned his departure. He left in June with the intention of supplying miners. He sailed on the ship Republic and disembarked in Victoria with a large inventory of miners' outfittings consisting of, so these would be like almost like backpacks, big bags that they would carry, consisting of flour, bacon, blankets, picks and shovels, all of the stuff they would need to go up into the wilderness and start, digging for gold. So these wares sold out quickly to prospectors looking to find supplies for their trek into the gold fields. Gibbs came prepared. He stayed in Victoria, resisting the temptation to go north to the fields like the other pioneers. Rather, the day after he disembarked, Gibbs bought a big one-story house on a town lot. I believe it's still standing in Victoria, for cash. And thanks to his carpentry skills, he single-handedly split the house into a residence and a mercantile business, which he operated in partnership with Lester. Gibbs quickly made a small fortune combining the sale of his wares and the purchase of real estate, which apparently, like some of our real estate in Canada now, seems to be doubling almost every month. When he expanded, he opened a store up the Fraser River just outside the Hudson's Bay Company fort. It was the first competitor to the Hudson's Bay Company in Victoria and in BC. His British acumen, the properties that he eventually bought, and his newfound connections opened doors for Gibbs beyond Victoria. It's tempting to talk about the 400 men and their families who eventually emigrated from California. And they participated in developing the Victoria and other parts of the province. However, the rest of my presentation is about Gibbs, the politician, and how he played a role in the making of our most Western province. One of the first political moves that Gibbs did undertake was sanctioning and supporting the establishment of Black police force in 1861. Historian Robin Winks believed Gibbs' support of the pioneers' rifles won him public favor, at least with Black community members. The idea for a Black militia was actually suggested in 1859 after whites, mostly American expats living in Victoria, they refused to accept Black men into the volunteer fire brigade, nor would they accept their authority as police officers. So even when they were deputized as police officers and they went to make an arrest, whites refused to go with them, saying that they would not allow themselves to be arrested by a Black man. Undeterred, the Black men asked and got support from Governor Douglas to form an all-Black militia under the Hudson's Bay Company. And at the time, Douglas was running the Hudson's Bay Company in BC. At the same time, he was governor of the island. Douglas got a drill sergeant from a vessel that was actually anchored in the harbor to teach these men how to use small arms. So in April 1860, they took the name Pioneer Rifles. Their wives helped them to fundraise, and they got money from HBC and some money from Black merchants and from whites looking to tamp down the rowdier elements of the public. Everybody was looking for some order because hundreds of prospectors coming into Victoria every day was really chaotic. And they were coming sometimes with lots of money in their pocket from gold, having found gold and trading money and goods at Hudson's Bay Company. And they would come into town to drink, get drunk out of their minds, and cause trouble. So through it all, the Rifles managed to finance 80% of their activities and help with keeping Victoria secure. While the US Civil War raged, Mifflin Gibbs supported the African Rifles. The Corps, but unfortunately, the Corps was disbanded after a series of missteps. First, when Governor Douglas did retire, his replacement was this gentleman here, Governor Arthur Edward Kennedy. Kennedy was just transferred from postings in Sierra Leone, Africa, and Australia. And he refused to accept that Black men carry guns and that they were capable of policing whites. So despite the rifle status in Victoria, because the Pioneer Rifles were made up of these Black merchants, kind of like, I guess, the National Guard, where you volunteer your time and you get some benefits, Kennedy decided to ignore the Corps for official duties, such as when he did bring in other, either the army or other militia, when it was the Queen's birthday and they had celebrations or other gala events. So realizing that the African Rifles, as they were sometimes called, that they were going to be snubbed and that they really didn't have enough resources to sustain their activities, they considered disbanding. The deal was sealed in 1864 when Governor Kennedy advised them to disband. Not quite in order, but pretty close. The Victoria Pioneer Rifles today is recognized as the first police force in Victoria, BC. Well, not quite 2 years as a resident, Gibbs' stature in the business community continued to rise, but his was not yet a household name. However, a couple of events led to his notoriety and eventually his high political role. Okay. Gibbs' political trajectory began with the 1860 elections for the House of Assembly on Vancouver Island. In a public election, Gibbs and 17 other Black male property owners voted as a bloc, and they split the vote. And this gentleman, Amor de Cosmos, lost the election. And at that time, women couldn't vote, and you could only vote if you were a male if you had property. Now, after the election, Gibbs publicly expressed the community's satisfaction at finally gaining the vote. But because he spoke out, he was singled out. His delight infuriated Amor de Cosmos, who happened to also be editor of the newspaper British Colonist. De Cosmos launched a bitter campaign against the immigrants, saying they had sold out themselves, their friends, and their company, and were to be blamed for the racism directed towards them. His editorials were scathing. The vote was illegal, the Commerce claimed, because a majority of the voters were not British subjects. Gibbs was a leader, articulate, a man of letters, and spoke for the interests of the Black settlers. So it's not surprising that Gibbs took issue with DeCosmo's remarks. So he sat down, he wrote to the newspaper, stressing the immigrants' loyalty to the British Constitution and their belief in equality. DeCosmos was not placated, and he continued his newspaper campaign to have the voters list verified. Gibbs believed that he was in the right and the community was in the right because even before the election, they had consulted with this gentleman, George Hunter Carey, who was the Attorney General of Vancouver Island. And Carey had reasoned that due to the Dred Scott decision that had the United States Supreme Court had made, that Blacks were without a country and they could vote as British subjects. Well, despite Carey's sanction, the courts disagreed. And in March 1861, most of the Black voters were disqualified. Though mollified by his victory, Gibbs remained in the crosshairs of DeCosmos for several years. This dust-up was not the last that Gibbs faced, and its lessons were not lost on him. Amor DeCosmos also realized the power of the Black vote and rarely hesitated to use the British colonist newspaper as a forum for anti-Black opinion. But the newspaper was not always able to bend opinion as easily as he wanted, because for a time on Vancouver Island, Blacks actually outnumbered whites. Many, having owned businesses or farms in California, had money to invest in the booming BC economy and could not be easily characterized as homeless, shifters, ne'er-do-wells, or thieves. And as a group, they stuck to their pack, determined to integrate and to succeed as farmers, tradespeople, small businessmen, and even gold prospectors. Well, Gibbs bided his time, knowing he would need to wait the requisite 7 years to make a play. In the meantime, his downtown business continued to thrive, and it propelled him into Victoria's upper crust in the neighborhood of James Bay. He married and raised 5 children in Victoria. Like the moneyed class, he favored certain causes and had access to the best the colony could offer. But unlike those of his financial class, Gibbs' race did not shield him from racist rebuffs. One incident in particular made him a household name, again in the British colonist newspaper. Here's a bit of the background. Across the country, in colonial Canada, theaters appeared to be places of racial contention. British Columbia was no different. In the early Victoria colony, whites often rotten-egged Blacks. Apparently, there was high tolerance for integrated seating in the gallery, but the sight of a Black man in the more expensive parketed seats below the gallery evidently provoked white theater goers who could not afford the higher seat price. And so when they went to the theater, they came armed. Blacks seated near the mezzanine or the stage would often be pelted with rotten eggs from the gallery above. And these tussles often led to court. On September 25th, 1861, a hospital benefit was waged for the Royal Columbian Hospital, Victoria's first hospital, and many Blacks came to that event. The event attracted some of the town's most prosperous Black residents, and Mifflin Gibbs was there with his pregnant wife, Maria. She was 8 months pregnant because she's about to give birth in October, and this happened in September. The couple had seats in the dress circle, just in front of Gibbs' old partner and his daughter. As the concert was about to begin, one of the performers refused to go on stage unless the Blacks were moved out of the dress circle. Well, the ushers walked over to the Blacks that were sitting there, including Gibbs, and asked them to move. They had paid for those seats, so they refused. Well, in a huff, the performer left the building and the concert began. But near the end of the concert, someone tossed a newspaper package full of flour right on top of Gibbs, and a cloud of flour spilled over onto Gibbs and his wife and the partner and the daughter that was sitting in front of them. Outraged, Gibbs and the partner began fist fighting with a group of whites that had been standing on the side, and they had been identified as having thrown the flour. Well, the police were called and everyone was charged. This melee was picked up by the British Colonist newspaper, and for several days, Gibbs was the talk of the town as letters for and against what happened were printed in various newspapers and street gossip swirled around. Not defined by the racism around him, in 1862, Gibbs befriended an English barrister, the defense lawyer George David Babington Ring. Ring agreed to tutor Gibbs in law in anticipation of Gibbs' public service on this side of the border. To the south, the U.S. was undergoing major upheaval, and Gibbs was not immune to the changes that were happening in the world around him. In 1864, he dissolved his partnership with Leicester. In 1865, his wife left Victoria with their 5 Canadian-born children for the United States. As the Civil War picked up, racist incidents increased in the colony. Gibbs, too, noted that there were efforts now to bar Blacks from areas that they had freely frequented and had really enjoyed as a group. The regional economy took a beating as well, and at the end of the Civil War's carnage, between April 9th, 1865 and August 1866, there was a decrease of anti-Black foment in the colony. But that's because many expats began trickling back to the United States. In the meantime, Gibbs found himself in the midst of a growing debate on the fate of BC and US annexation versus ties to Confederation to the east. Then in 1866, Gibbs became a naturalized British subject. In 1866, Mifflin Gibbs finally ran for city council for the new municipal government of Victoria. His first speech was at an all-candidates meeting. Surprisingly, the British Colonist newspaper found Gibbs' oration the most interesting and wrote a positive review of his candidacy. However, despite the glowing terms, Gibbs lost by the narrowest of margins. And despite Gibbs' electioneering, the cosmos prevailed again. Well, Gibbs was philosophical. The defeat was only a temporary setback, and the small gap in the spread of the vote seemed to demonstrate that the Black community was now a genuine political power in the colony. He had lost by 4 votes, and he was actually quite happy that some Blacks chose not to vote for him, but made up their own mind and were independent enough to choose for themselves. few months later, on Friday, November 9th, 1866, Mifflin Wistar Gibbs ran successfully for a seat on Victoria City Common Council, representing James Bay Ward, Victoria's wealthiest neighborhood. Gibbs made history that day, becoming the first Black person in BC elected to public office. Within a short time, his abilities came to the fore. He wound up chairing the powerful finance committee, vowing to clean up the city finances. By the end of his first term, he had paid down the municipality's considerable debt. There were smiles all around. Now well established in Victoria, Gibbs' profile in the rest of the province became better known. Thanks to his business interests in the Cariboo and elsewhere, Gibbs traveled and kept pace with the Blacks and partners in far-flung parts of the province. Though his eyes were fixed upon the challenges of local governance, Gibbs could not ignore the rising buzz around the colony's future in the hands of the Provincial Assembly. And the one person he knew who was taking up the challenge in the Assembly was his old rival, editor, publisher, Amor de Cosmos. Ignoring de Cosmos' previous anti-Black rhetoric, pragmatic Gibbs became involved in the Confederation issue. Since early 1867, Cosmos had been working to get members of the Legislative Assembly to come together and hammer out conditions for joining Confederation. But de Cosmos could not get unanimity to even begin such talks. So, bypassing the logjam in the Assembly, in May 1868, together, Gibbs and de Cosmos decided to establish a new mechanism. In concert with a few assemblymen, they established the Confederation League to organize a province-wide convention on Monday, September 14th that year. Delegates would vote their views on union with Canada and hammer out terms of BC's entry into Confederation. In 1868, under the rules of the Confederation League, the residents of Salt Spring Island elected Mr. Gibbs as their delegate to the Yale Convention. Now, you're probably wondering, as I did, where is Yale? Well, at that time, if you took a boat of any kind from Vancouver up the Fraser River, you could only go as far as Yale, because the river above Yale was too rough for boats to navigate. All goods and people had to pass through Yale. From here, they were transferred to horses, mule trains, or wagons, and taken farther north by road into the gold fields. This is why Yale became such a busy town. The discovery of gold in 1849 caused a massive influx from all over the world, and Yale suddenly became a very large city with many stores, and was known as the biggest city west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. On September 14th, 1868, a meeting of 26 Confederation League delegates from across the colony was held in the town of Yale. The convention was not initially a meeting of the minds. Delegates from the mainland were apparently wholeheartedly in favor of Confederation. Not surprisingly, the delegates representing American sentiment towards annexation of Oregon came from the coast, that is Vancouver Island, including Victoria. Gibbs of Salt Spring Island appeared to be the exception to that rule. Well, that day, the debate on the floor swayed back and forth, with the annexation sentiment gaining sway. Gibbs took charge. He stood up, some say on a table, no less, and put forth his best oration skills. He captivated delegates with a rousing speech. The tide turned. All efforts focused upon creating a document with clear demands for joining the Confederation. After a day's work, the Confederation League passed 37 resolutions outlining the terms for a union with the Dominion of Canada. The die was cast. The country Canada would touch two seas. I'm going to stop here. It's tempting to go on and on about so many other achievements that Gibbs attained while in Canada. A quick Google search will yield those. And you can also learn about his life of great wealth and stature in the US, because that's well documented in African American historiography. Black American historians cannot ignore Gibbs, the banker. They couldn't ignore Gibbs, the ambassador, Gibbs, the mayor, Gibbs, the first Black judge, et cetera, et cetera. But as I laid out in my introduction, this story is to introduce you to an unknown and unheralded father of Confederation. His sojourn in Canada has left a legacy few realize. I'm not implying he's forgotten in Canada. No. In fact, within BC, Gibbs has been honored with many public monuments, streets, parks, all kinds of things have been named after him. But it was his exceptional role, of which all Canadians benefit, regardless of where they are, that I believe we need to salute. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to make that case tonight. Oh, and I'm going to ask you one more question. Do you think Gibbs should be in the club? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. That's a marvelous presentation and a story of perseverance and this marvelous man who was ambitious and successful, and despite all the social and political obstacles and restrictions in his way. And it's you've told a remarkable story, and thank you so much. I'm going to pass it just over quickly to Glenn, because he's going to explain to everybody how to ask you questions in the tech world. So I'll mute myself and pass it over to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Heather. Good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm helping with the tech. So if you're on Zoom, you may have noticed already, you can't unmute yourselves. That's intentional. If you have a question you would like to ask, put it in the chat box. So if you're new to Zoom, the chat box is on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And you don't have to type in your question. You can just say, I have a question, and then we'll queue you up and we'll unmute you and you can come on and ask. If you're watching on Facebook, just leave us a comment there and we'll check over there and try to relay your comments for you. So back over to you, Heather.
Great, thank you. Dorothy, I have a quick question for you. Do you think that if the Black community had not come to BC, that it may have been annexed to the United States?
Wow. I don't think so. I think it would have been the wish. Probably, you know, the squeaky wheel gets a lot of attention, or needs to be greased. I'm not sure what the, but I think they were, in other words, they were a vocal minority. I don't think they were majority in the province. But obviously their arguments were so persuasive that even there was a small group of people at that convention, and obviously in that one room, and they're making decisions, it might have actually pushed them the other way. I think it would have just delayed the inevitable. At the time, the federal government was negotiating with the Hudson's Bay. They had already seceded BC. Well, that's why Governor Douglas was running BC as well, as because at one point it was just a colony, right? And then the whole BC territory. I think they would have negotiated with it just to get the railways past Saskatchewan and Alberta. So it might have happened. It might have happened slowly. I don't think the Americans had staying power in the colony.
Okay.
So, and it would have had to happen on both ends, right? So even though they were talking annexation here, that discussion also had to be going on in San Francisco and Oregon and the United States. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's just it struck me as you know, this was a a really courageous group of people that came in here, and just try something new, and they had a strong voice together. So I just wondered how
Yeah, I
influential they
must say
were.
I was surprised as well, especially when I read about how they had made this pack in San Francisco, that they
Yeah.
weren't going. It was such a unique thing that they weren't even going to set up their own Black churches. That just floored me, because I don't think at any time in Canadian history, and anywhere, that I've ever seen a Black community making that decision, and seeing the results of it. But they had been pushed so much in California, and they saw what segregation did and isolation. Um, Lester himself, he had his daughter in a private school in San Francisco. She was the only Black child in that school. And when these laws started to, the sort of the tenor started to pick up and become more racist, they forced him to take his daughter out of school. He was crushed by that.
Oh,
He
yeah.
wanted to give her the best education he was able to financially, and he really did not want to have that happen again. So he was one of the mouthpieces. But this is about Gibbs, not Lester.
Right. All right, let's see if other people do have questions, because I could, Dorothy and I have had many conversations, and she always blows my mind with all the information she has. So,
I have one. I can't resist asking. Always curious. I realize, in a lot of pioneer movements in North America, Black people were very important, but they're not remembered. And I wondered, was there any continuity of that African American community in Victoria or Vancouver Island into the 20th century and even into the present?
Yeah, actually, there are some families that have connections that are cross-border. And some of them are actually quite celebrated within the Black community out west. So they have Facebook families that get together, and they have picnics that bring the two sides of the family across the border into like Salt Spring Island and other communities in BC. I don't know how many of the 400 families remain, but the ones that did were quite significant. I know there was one family, the Alexanders, I believe, that had 200 descendants, and they get together, I think, every 2 years for a picnic, I think on either side of the border, just from that couple, that Black couple in BC, the 200 descendants. So it is, I think that connection to Victoria. He also, Gibbs also writes in his biography how he was so attached to the place, to Victoria, because that's where his children were born. That's where he created a family. He built 2 homes in Victoria, one originally when he got there, and then he moved to James Bay, a more wealthy, posh area out of the downtown core. And he built the home that his wife, he and his wife and his 5 children had. So he has fond memories of the place, even though he went back to the United States, which a lot of Americans did after the war, because they believed in what was being said, Reconstruction and whatever, which of course wound up failing. But at the time, there was this great sort of promise for Black people and the freedom of slavery, right? Slavery was over. We're gonna change America. And so the brightest minds, the best minds, a lot of them said, you know what, we're gonna go back and help to recreate the United States and make it a better place. Well, it backfired, but at the time, the impetus was there. In his case, he winds up going back. He obviously loved law because he got his sort of initial training in Victoria, from Ring. And he winds up going to law school and becoming the first Black judge in, I think, one of the states. He becomes one of the first Black judges, and is quite celebrated for that, and becomes ambassador to Madagascar. He gets picked, and the first Black judge, and the first Black mayor, I think, of Arkansas in the United States. So his trajectory in the United States just phenomenal. He was able to take advantage of so many things, but I think he was cushioned by his wealth. He was quite wealthy by the time he went back to the United States, which meant he moved on a slightly higher plane. I'm not saying he didn't have any sort of racist incidents such as this, but he was shielded in many ways. You know, you have servants around you, you're protected at a certain class level. So anyway,
Sure.
I'll
We have
be quiet. I want to answer a question. Did I answer your question? Sorry.
Yes, and then some. And I always love when you answer and then some, Dorothy. We have a question, and I think this ties in because it's an exploration. This is from Pamela on Zoom here. She's asking if you remember the moment when you met Mr. Gibbs and you knew that you had to explore his life and delve into this fascinating piece of Canadian history.
So she's asking me, what's the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, what do you remember the moment when you discovered or when you met Mr. Gibbs, and what made you know that you had to follow up this story?
Oh wow! But when I say I mean it was decades ago. It was a story that I had come across maybe in the 70s, maybe as early as that. One of the very first stories, I mean, I've been collecting Black history and archives and material on the Canadian Black experience since I was almost a teenager. I'd say my very early 20s when I realized that that's what I needed to do. This was really part of my life's calling. And this was one of the stories that I came across. It was actually in a newspaper put out, I believe, by the Negro Community Center at the time. It was one of the stories. I think every issue they came out with a particular story on some Black figure, usually Canadian. And I just sopped all of that up. I mean, I loved history anyway. So, and I just thought his story was just so fascinating, even then. But it's hard for me to remember. I mean, gosh, that's a good 50 years ago almost. Yeah.
I have a comment from Barbara on in the chat. She said, "We on the East Coast learn nothing of this, nor the First Nation problems with the way the treaties, ownership, and understandings were viewed by the British. Then Canada. It does take the brightest of minds."
Me? The brightest of minds? Well, I don't know about the brightest of minds. I was just insatiably curious, you know. I know sometimes really curious kids are annoying to adults because they kind of break their own rhythm, you know, when you're doing things. But a child whose curiosity is nurtured, I know they say one of the greatest things, it's not smarts, it's imagination, but it's also about curiosity. I think if you're always asking questions, if you want to know more, if you're ready to push and just turn that next page, teacher tells you to read to this part in the page and your eye continues because you want to know more and you want to know, why isn't she letting us read to this? You know, if your mind is like that, you're going to find things that maybe you shouldn't, or things that delight you. And so finding out things that my friends didn't know about, or that my teachers didn't know about, was really, it kind of just built on itself. So that's why it's sort of like part of my passion, part of what I do, because I want to know more. And I know there are many more stories, you know, that we don't know about, or I don't know the ins and outs of yet, you know?
Yeah.
And every time I do one of these stories, I'm like, I want to do more about this guy's life. But I'm like, oh no, I've got 10 others that I have to do.
I got some questions asked about that after, but we have Rod here. Rod, I'm going to unmute you. You have a question.
Thanks. First of all,
hi, Rod.
Dorothy, you asked.
No, you're not getting this one. You're not getting this one. I asked you about the porters. That's enough. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, we're not going to talk shop. You asked. So, yeah, he's got my vote for the club, for sure. I don't know whether you want us all to weigh in on that, but I was, you didn't specifically characterize Mr. Gibbs as a dynamic speaker, but I wonder if you think he was. And you did talk about his activism early on in Philadelphia and so forth. And you mentioned, of course, Frederick Douglass. And I don't know whether, I mean, not everybody that heard Frederick Douglass and was an activist, I suppose, would instinctively become a dynamic speaker, but I mean, what an influence. So I don't know, but it sounds like somebody like Mr. Gibbs was sort of, or I wonder whether that's your view, that he was part of his success, if you like, was just he was fun to listen to, and and people were moved by listening to him. I don't know.
He's I mean, I've read excerpts from his biography. His biography is called Shadow and Light. And when I read that, I'm thinking this was a kid who had to leave school at the age of 8. And so I'm thinking of him as an autodidact. I'm thinking of him, and obviously he loved lifelong learning, all of that. It's just amazing, his ability, his articulation, his ability to be articulate, even though he wasn't formally trained, right? It was almost like, because that library society that he belonged to was kind of like the equivalent of the Mechanics Institute of what we would have had, not formal education, but sort of like lifelong learning kinds of things. And yet he embraced it so well. I suspect he probably got some of his techniques of oration from Frederick Douglass, who is well known as an incredible orator. He could speak to crowds of hundreds. He moved people. He was incredibly persuasive. And I think that's what Gibbs, he learned techniques of persuasion, and probably, but I'm just extrapolating, probably modeled himself very young, listening to these abolitionists who were making the case to end slavery in the United States and northern United States. So, yeah, I don't know. You actually have to read his book. It's amazing because one of the complaints they had is it just was too flowery. It was wonderfully, excessively British speak at that time. Yeah, quite beautiful.
Okay.
We have Vicky up next. Thanks, Rod. Vicky, I'm just going to unmute you. Give me a second there. You should be good.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. I just want to thank Mrs. Williams for her presentation. That was wonderful. I've seen you many years ago. I was a student of Greg Robinson, so I really enjoy your presentation. And so I thought I would ask you, we know that throughout all these years since the 19th century and so on, that many organizations like Ku Klux Klan and White Citizen Councils, other organizations like that, they were really harsh towards African American people and Black people, and especially the ones that were thriving, like Mr. Gibbs. And I was wondering if he or his family they supported that kind of a threat towards their family or himself. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of the incident of the thugs and that kind of, but that's not quite the same thing. No. The only time that I'm, again, in his biography, he actually mentions that his brother in the States actually slept with a gun under his pillow because the Ku Klux Klan would come every night and parade around his house. So he was terrorized in the States, but no, I don't.
Dorothy, I'm wondering if I could follow up on that. I know that there was KKK activity in Ontario, including in the 20th century, and Manitoba. Did it ever go, is there a knowledge of it going further west to BC?
Because you're talking about the KKK in like 1904, 1912. We're talking the period of
different eras.
1850s, 1860s. Yeah, no, I don't remember that coming up in any of the stories at all. No.
We have a question from Lisa. I'm just gonna unmute you there, Lisa. You're up next. Should be good.
Okay, thank you. Hi. Actually, I have a few comments. One is I'm actually in San Mateo, California right now, which is halfway between San Francisco and San Jose.
Yes.
But my mother's entire family lives in the province of Quebec. My mom is the only one that left. But I just want to say that we've never heard of him here either. And it's interesting to me, and I am actually an 11th grade US history teacher. So I'm coming, it's only 5 here, but I'm coming from teaching school today. I think it's interesting to note that in 2008, the city of San Francisco actually issued a formal proclamation of apology to the African Americans who left in 1858.
Oh, wow.
So if it, 150 years before, who went up to BC and
Vancouver, yeah,
Salt Spring Island,
exactly.
etc.
Wow.
And that's right when I first heard about this, even though I don't live in San Francisco, but it was
Right.
around then. And I agree, once you hear any part of his story, it's fascinating. I'm a wannabe writer, and I immediately thought, oh, I'm going to write this wonderful historical fiction set in with this group of people that is absolutely fascinating to me. That said, as a US history teacher, I've had many, many, many opportunities and great good fortune to spend time with Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, who was one of the Little Rock Nine. And of course, Little Rock Nine, famous for integrating Central High School. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So she does a lot of work with high school students, American high school students, on civil rights and all that kind of thing. But I'm sure you know that ultimately she moved and lived many decades in Ontario. And then moved back and did some of this work. And then ultimately, I think she's in Burnaby, BC right now.
BC, yeah.
But I've seen her just so many times. And it's to the point now that when I see her, she says, how's the novel coming along? Tell me again what it's about. So I tell her, blah, blah, blah. And she says to me, well, where did you get this? So I'm telling her about Mr. Gibbs. And she says, what was his name? And I said, Mifflin Wistar Gibbs. She goes, Lisa, that was the name of my elementary school in Little Rock.
There you go.
Or she went on to become one of the Little Rock Nine and
Yes.
go.
Mm-hmm.
There still does remain a Mifflin Wistar Gibbs High School in Little Rock. So I just wanted to share that weird connection. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for telling me, because I did see when you type in Google all of the commemorations and memorializations, then it's not that he's not recognized. It was just that little piece of his history, which everybody seems to sort of gloss over. They spend so much time talking about Amor de Cosmos and what he did. And he's like, oh, well, he should be a Father of Confederation. That the role that Gibbs played is totally, totally unknown. But yeah, who he was as an individual has not been lost on the people of BC. And, provincially, municipally, there are plaques throughout the whole city talking about him and his contribution to Victoria.
Fabulous. Thank you. I very much enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And please let us know when you publish that story, because there'll be a crowd here in Quebec and in BC that'll be interested.
Will do.
Dorothy, maybe I already know the answer to this, but did any of the other fathers of Confederation make some sort of acknowledgement to Mr. Gibbs? Like, thanks there, Mr. Gibbs, for bringing BC into Confederation? No.
I wouldn't think so. No. I wouldn't think so. Any more than they would have known that he was the first Black person elected. I mean, you don't often. I mean, nowadays, of course, with the internet, you can find out right away who was the first that did blah blah, right, with Google. But in those days, it wouldn't have been seen as being exceptional, and they wouldn't have known him as being the first of anything, really.
Yeah. Okay. So I was kind of hoping, but I kind of knew the answer.
No.
Well, see, are there any other questions? Because we're sort of going to wrap up the evening, but I don't want to say goodbye unless someone else has a question. Glenn, was there anything from Facebook?
I didn't see anything on Facebook, no.
Okay. Well, then I guess that we will finish tonight. And Dorothy, I just wanted to thank you so much. This has been a marvelous presentation about a man that many of us have never heard of, but we should know. And I'm so grateful that I do know about him now. I'm going to do some more research and really spread the news about Mr. Gibbs. I mean, how wonderful. And for a little while he was a Canadian, and we can be really proud of that. So, but thank you for sharing the story. And as always, you blew my mind with information. So.
Well, I knew that not everybody here would know a lot about BC history, so I wanted to make sure, you kind of marched with me in terms of understanding the context of who and what he was all about.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, when we were talking about what we could talk about. And you said, that even though it's BC history, it's Canadian history, and
Yes,
we changed Canadian
absolutely.
Confederation and Quebec history. And
Mhm.
so it's wonderful.
Heather, nobody answered my question.
Which
should
was?
Should he be admitted to the club? What's the question?
Yes, I
second
say
that.
yes. I think there's thumbs up all around. So
Okay, good. I'm glad I just wanted to know I made the case. That's good.
Indeed.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
We're going to remind everyone that next week, next Thursday, May 20th, is our next session is with Textile Stories, the Bruck Mills and its Legacy with Suzanne Morin. So right here on Heritage Talks Facebook page at 7 o'clock. So that should be an interesting discussion, and it would be wonderful if you all came back. Thanks very much to Glenn for managing everybody on our tech. Thanks to our friends and our members who've joined us again. And one more time, thank you to Dorothy. And take care, everyone, and have a nice evening and stay safe. Bye for now.